Welcome to Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance by voices within the independent Catholic movement. For more information on inclusive Catholicism, please visit extraordinarycatholics.faith. And now, meet your hosts, Reverend Dr. Trish Sullivan-Bonney and Reverend Dr. Jayme Matthias.
Welcome to Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance. I'm Father Jayme Matthias.
And I am Reverend Trish Sullivan-Bonney.
And Reverend Trish, on this 800th anniversary of the passing of St. Francis of Assisi, we have a special guest, Reverend Trish.
Yes, indeed we do. So I am super excited to have with us a mutual friend of ours, Jayme, Father Steven McMichael, one of our dear Franciscan friends. So I know that this podcast is going to get a real bump in attention in the Eden Prairie cohort. I got to know Stephen through his amazing gifts of homiletic in my home parish of Pax Christi Catholic Community over the years, where he has been sort of, I don't know, what would you call yourself, Stephen? You were kind of like a fill-in guy, a regular supporter of a parish that was a little on the understaffed side for clergy. Over the years, I've had a chance to listen to Stephen tell a lot of stories about his Franciscan journey, his life as a medievalist. I also got to know him a little bit through my work at Liturgical Press years ago. So your spirituality, Stephen, has come through to so many people just sitting in the pews. And in this little window of time, Jayme and I were thinking, wow, we'd love to talk about the charisms that have shaped us as Catholics, because even though we are independent of Rome, we still are grounded so deeply in the tradition. Stephen is also a professor of theology at the University of St. Thomas, one of our lead Catholic universities in our region. And yes, he is extremely loyal. He has been known to really piss off the St. John's fans on a Sunday when UST has triumphed in the football arena. So anyway, I'm just really delighted to have you with us, Stephen. And did I leave anything out? What else should we know about you as our non-Eden Prairie folks get to know you through our podcast?
Well, as they know, I'm also still play hockey at an old age, so I'm still keeping my Minnesota roots alive on the rink, especially celebrating the two Olympian champions, the men's and women's team.
Absolutely. Yes, hockey is a big deal here in Minnesota, and I grew up on the East Coast where it's not so much. And I want to see you play hockey in that habit of yours. I'm coming out for that. So anyway, and Jayme, you have Franciscan roots, and you had a time in your life when you knew Stephen. So I'm going to turn it back to you to kick us off with the first couple of questions for our honored guest.
Thank you, Reverend Trish. Father Steven and I go back, we were saying, some 35 years now since I started formation with the Conventual Franciscan Friars in St. Louis, Missouri. Fond memories. You know, words could never express adequately my gratitude to the friars, for people like Father Kevin Shavilsky, who first invited me to consider this way of life. Just friars, Wayne Hellman, Kevin Godfrey, Hans Christofferson, Stephen McMichael, Randall Kinn, Adam Bennell, Tom Rice. I could go on and on and on, singing the praises of the friars. But this episode is not about me. So, Father Steven, I think the question that comes to mind for me and for many of our listeners is the story of your vocation. Tell us something about how it is that the Lord has you on this path in which you find yourself. Who are some of the people who played into the story of your vocation? And how is it that the Spirit brought you from where you were, say, as a teenager and as a young man, to where you are today?
Well, thank you for both of you for having me here. My vocation actually begins here in Minnesota. I grew up in Minnetonka, so I'm a skipper. We go to Minnetonka Skipper High School, and that's in the western suburbs of Minneapolis. And I grew up with the typical thing of the late 60s, early 70s. High school was kind of a rough time, especially because of a lot of the extracurricular activities we were doing in high school, not necessarily study. So So actually, I didn't do too well in high school, and during my senior year, I was going through a conversion experience, especially reading Thomas Merton, listening to the music of George Harrison, who was going through his own conversion experience, and also getting to know Francis. So I came on a retreat where I live now in the Franciscan Retreat Center, Prior Lake. I came on a retreat here for young adults, and that kind of turned me on to Francis. And so at that time, I didn't even know what I was doing. But in 1975, I chose to enter the formation community in St. Louis. So I did that. And that's when I met Wayne Hellman, Father Wayne Hellman, who is a Bonaventure expert and also other Franciscan things. And he is basically my mentor throughout life. He turned me on to Francis and the Franciscan tradition. And so that led me actually years later to, after I got my BA at St. Louis University, I went to the Franciscan Institute and studied a Franciscan spirituality there, which then led me to Rome. I studied in Rome for 5 years in the 80s and then ended up doing my doctoral dissertation and finished in 92. And that was, I was working on this Alfonso de Spina. A Franciscan of the 15th century wrote a text called The Fortress of Faith Against Jews, Muslims, Christians, and Demons, and very polemical stuff. And so then I went back to St. Louis University, and I was teaching as an adjunct for about 8 years at WashU and St. Louis University and other places in St. Louis. And then we closed our formation house in St. Louis in 2000. So I actually came up here to Minnesota, got a visiting professorship at the University of St. Thomas, which led to a tenure track position. So I've been at St. Thomas now 26 years, and I continue to teach medieval theology here, and especially focusing in on the Franciscan tradition. And so my work recently is I published a book a couple years ago on Mary Magdalene and the medieval Franciscan tradition. In fact, I still do retreats and do other things and expand that knowledge about Mary Magdalene. She's become one of my great heroes, and as she was for the Franciscans of the Middle Ages. And I'm also working on a book now on the herring of hell, the descent of Jesus in Holy Saturday stuff. On a book in the medieval Franciscan tradition, looking at art, literature, theology, and so forth. And also another book that I'm working on is the one that I'm really more excited about. I am working on a book on mercy and compassion in the writings of Francis, according to recent scholarship in the Italian world. It's friars and non-friars who have been writing about mercy and compassion for the last 15 years. So I'm putting together a book about borrowing from a lot of these authors and my own self-reflection. So that in a nutshell is who I am.
Father
Well,
Steven, what a delight to be connected with you after 36 years after our meeting. You speak of two heroes. So before I go back to Reverend Trish, I just have to ask about the two of the names that you just mentioned here. One is Wayne Hellman. For those of us who've heard that name before, Father Wayne Hellman was the chair of the Department of Theology at St. Louis University for some time. I remember when I first met him some 36 years ago, he was the minister provincial of the Conventual Franciscan Friar. So you have to tell us, what is he up to these days? But the other name that you mentioned in terms of heroes is Mary Magdalene. Is there what can we as listeners learn from this medieval interest, this medieval Franciscan interest in Mary Magdalene? Tell us about Father Wayne Hellman and Mary Magdalene, if you would.
Well, Father Wayne Hellman, his travels around the world. I mean, I believe he's 86 now, but he goes to Korea, the Philippines, in Zambia, and Africa. I mean, in Germany, he's all over the place, but his main focus has been working on Bonaventure and the theologian that was writing at the same time as Thomas Aquinas, writing about his sacramental theology and virtues and stuff. In fact, he is now, I think he just finished a book on the virtues in the theology of Bonaventure. So, I mean, he's still very active and lives in Cary, Ohio, or that he lives there, I think, like maybe 1 week a year. But close to where you grew up, Jayme. And so,
Well, before we jump into Mary Magdalene, I actually want to set the stage a little bit because you guys are both like deeply embedded in Franciscan culture, in Francis's story, in all the ways in which Franciscan spirituality expresses itself. So I was like you, Stephen. I sojourned with the Jesuits for 4 years as an
Mhm.
undergrad, and then I went on to St. John's, which is Benedictine. And it wasn't until I was in Berkeley doing my PhD that I encountered Franciscan spirituality through the Franciscan School of Theology, which is sadly no longer on the footprint of the GTU. But I want to know a little bit more about Francis. So, we all have these like kind of simplistic pictures of Francis. We see, there's always, he's got the statue with the bird, in people's gardens, right? Or we hear these little aphorisms that I think later I found out that aren't even necessarily attached to Francis, like the one about you know, preach the gospel always, if necessary, use words, right? So, but who is Francis? And clearly he captivates you enough that you've devoted your life to deepening your understanding of not only him and his spirituality, but what he set in motion through people like Bonaventure. So, for those of us who are Franciscan neophytes, paint a picture for us of who this person was, when he lived, what his setting was, and what was so unique about him during his time.
Well, Francis is, he was born in 1182, 83. We're not sure about that, and dies in 1226. Part of the whole new, what we would call in the world of medieval studies, the 12th century Renaissance. A lot was going on at that time, especially devoted to lay spirituality, because this is a move from going from feudal times to city life, urban. A lot of the cities in medieval Europe were coming alive. Francis was part of this. He was born to a somewhat wealthy cloth merchant father, Pietro. I always want to say Pietro Bernardoni. His mother was French. Francis grew up like a typical child of that time, of seeking to move up in the world, because in Assisi they divided themselves between the what they call the minores, the people that were lower, and then the maiores, which were the upper class, the nobles. And Francis wanted to have that. In that time, the fast track would have been to become a knight. And so Francis engaged in war, we know, between Assisi and Perugia. That's a very complicated thing. But I think that war experience had a very tremendous, had a tremendous influence on Francis. And after that experience, after he's in prison, he was sick. He sought consolation, actually, I think, in being alone, in solitude. So that comes into play, this more contemplative life. We also know that he sought this in nature. We also know that, well, according to his testament, the first thing that happens to him is actually an encounter with a leper. And so he, rather than moving up in the world, he sort of goes down because lepers were found outside of the city. And this this led to an encounter that he had in San Damiano, this chapel just outside of Assisi, where he experienced the cross of San Damiano. And the sources tell us that it was actually the communication was "repair my church," which but more recent studies, especially this Capuchin writer from Italy, Pietro Marinese. I translated a book of his just because I find his stuff, his material just so great that Francis saw the face of Jesus. And so he connected up the leper and the cross and that face of Jesus. And this is where he experienced mercy and compassion. And so the rest of his life was that. And so I see this more so than poverty now, because we Franciscans have been known for the vow of poverty and 800 years of arguing about what does that mean for us in terms of poverty. It's about mercy and compassion. So he starts with the leper, and that extends out then to like the community, like these circles, the community, and then it's out in nature. And so he's seeing that compassion and mercy centered. And this is why Francis wrote the Canticle of Creatures, which is really a celebration of the harmony of all creation, but also viewing humanity as sort of, because of original sin, Francis would have accepted that, we are, the only way we can enter into the harmony of the rest of creation is through acts of mercy and compassion, I think is. And so that's what I think really Francis wanted to demonstrate. And I think part of his spirituality is walking in the footprints of Jesus. And so the very human, compassionate Jesus we see reflected more, I think, in Luke's gospel than the other gospels, that I think that's where Francis embodied. And so it becomes, and this is why he chose poverty, because Jesus, and he always includes Mary in this, that they chose poverty, so I'm going to choose that poverty. The element that comes from the Benedictine tradition also of humility. So he saw himself as a humble person before lepers, but also, I think, in the broader sense of all of humanity, and then also including Muslims, and then also of creation itself. And so he sees this bond of mercy and compassion throughout all of these different circles, especially human, and then out into creation. If
Father
that makes
Stephen,
sense.
I have to ask two related questions then when it comes to St. Francis. One is there anything that our listeners might be surprised to learn about St. Francis? For instance, as a young friar, I just remember when I heard that St. Francis did not personally write the prayer of St. Francis, the words that we attribute to him, Lord, make me an instrument or a channel of your peace. I was just like, mind blown. Wait a minute, Francis didn't write this. Is there anything that might surprise our listeners about Francis and his life and or spirituality or charism? And my second question is, on this 800th anniversary of his passing, are there any books or movies or sources that you might recommend for us to learn more about Francis and this charism? I know as a boy, for instance, Murray Bodo's book, The Journey and the Dream, was just the thing in the 1980s to introduce people to St. Francis. There was some movie back in the late 70s, early 80s, I think, that it was about St. Francis. I remember going to a parish showing of this film and just being frightened a bit by St. Francis's encounter with the lepers. So my two questions are, what might surprise us about Francis's life and spirituality? And where are the best places for us to learn more about him on this 800th anniversary of his passing?
Well, I think probably some of the things that I really think, as I continue to study Francis and read the writings, I think the thing would be really surprising is Francis would have been really rough. I mean, really rough in the sense of demanding of the community. As I mentioned, this thing of mercy and compassion. This is a very difficult thing to do, especially in the world in which he lived, because conflicts were solved by violence most often. He included, experienced violence in a war between Assisi and Perugia. We know that he would have experienced violence from his father when he beat him and so forth, and when he thought Francis was crazy for rebuilding these churches and stuff and hanging around lepers. And so this, I really think when I read, especially Francis's admonitions, there's 28 of them. This is really rough stuff. I mean, this is like he demands a radical discipleship. And I think this is what, so the image we have of Francis sitting around with birds around him and, it's great. But I don't think it really captures the real sense of Francis, of what he experienced with he experienced with lepers, which he experienced with all of creation. But I think, especially with the brothers, I mean, he really demanded that we really show that compassion and mercy to our brothers that we're living with. And as we know in families, the hardest people to love are the peoples that are right around us, right? Familiarity breeds contempt, as the Romans would say. So this is like the thing. So, but I just thinking of recent literature, I really want to promote Michael Casado, OFM, his book that's on Francis. I can't remember the title of it, but it's very good because Michael Casado puts Francis in the context of basically the laity and of other people. He, especially women, he he contextualizes this in saying it's just not about Francis. It's about how Francis interacted with these other people, including Clare, but also especially secular Franciscans. All of this was a movement because it's really following the rise of these apostolic movements in the 12th century. This is a major thing that I'm looking at now because this leads to groups of women like the Beguines. And I mean, there's a lot of, what's really exciting for me in medieval studies right now is all of the people that are writing on these topics. And Francis wanted to embrace the apostolic life, like a lot of people did. It was the wave of the time. Another book I would recommend is Andrew Vichet, which is actually teaches in Paris. I think he's retired now, but he wrote a really great book. In fact, he was Michael Casado's mentor and his thesis director, so he shaped that. But Vichet takes a strong approach of seeing Francis in the context of the medieval times and stuff. In terms of movies, the movie I still love. In fact, I just watched it when I was in Rome. Just in January was Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon. It's Zeffirelli's film on Francis that I think was made in like 1970, early 70s. And it's sort of Francis's a very romantic view of things, but I really find he captured this sense of this. Later in the 80s, a woman director and I can't remember her name, came up with a movie called Francesco, which has Mickey Rourke as Francis and Father Paul Schlomer, a conventual friar and living currently in San Antonio, and I have an argument about this. I think it's the worst casting ever. Mickey Rourke, he is a stilted, doesn't look like Francis would have looked at all. Paul thinks it's brilliant casting. But anyway, I shouldn't get into these inner polemic stuff. But it really captures, though, the positive thing is it really captures the social dimension of Francis and really about this taking care of the poor and the sick and lepers. And it really captures and there's a tremendous scene of the stigmata that happens in 1224, 2 years before Francis dies, about how this confirms for Francis that he has been faithful to living out the gospel. And I think that's what, so those are the two movies that I recommend. Just if you could get by Mickey Rourke being Francis, it's a great movie.
Well, we do a movie night once a month, so I'm putting that on our list, even. Although I might have to have you come eat popcorn with us, given we have good geography for that. So there were two things that came up. One, Jayme mentioned, which was to the recovery of the dignity and importance of Mary of Magdala. But before we go to that, you said something very briefly that had my mind flash to my beloved Franciscan, who was Father Kenan Osborne, who was one of the people who helped shape the work that I did as a theologian, and his focus was so powerfully over the course of his writing on the church and ecclesiology on the dignity of laity. And you said something very briefly about Francis's inclusion of lay charism in its own way. So I'd love to hear any more you have to say about that. I mean, we are talking about the 12th century, but these are still issues we grapple with today, and that can inform the way we see ourselves as disciples and faithful people. And then, of course, where Jayme wanted to start, which I know there are some listeners dying to get back to this, which is, this very important, the apostle to the apostles, right? So wondering what you could share with us about those two topics.
The first one again is about the laity. Yeah, and I think, and this is why I think the way that I'm seeing this, especially because of all the work being done in medieval studies about lay apostolic groups, the poor Catholics, I can't think of the other groups that I'm in my senior moment here.
Well, the Beguines were very much a sort of bridge sort of organization that didn't quite get to the point of being professed and retained a lot of the rights and liberty of lay women. Of course, we know they were ultimately condemned by the church. But yeah, so there definitely was a flourishing at that time around that.
Yeah, because I think I actually am I'm a what do you call it, spiritual assistant to a secular Franciscan group here that's been very active. And some of the friars have sort of a negative view of this. They think it's like a tea club, and whatever. But I find I've been given a lot of life through them because they do a lot of apostolic work out of the thing. This is a very small group. I think we're about 15 now. And we do every month we get together at our meetings. We actually read something about Francis. We're actually going through a book on Clare right now. And so they're active, engaged. And I think in the time of Francis, it was very much, he did not see this simply as a movement of men or just simply of women with the Poor Clares. And so he saw this as a movement of anyone can do this, but I think Francis didn't have the expectation that people of laity would have the same sort of approach to radical poverty that he did. I think there was a nuanced way of viewing that. But he certainly saw this as all of these people can live out the gospel and, in the ways that he saw this compassionate Jesus. And so I think this is where I've gone to in my own writing and teaching, and especially teaching in the classroom, saying, that Francis saw this as this is really living the gospel, and this is for everyone. And so it's part of a wave that's going on, and like it said, it does. One of the roots of that goes into the Beguines, for example. I'm really fascinated with that, but it's also connected up with Francis' vision that this thing could be lived by anyone, with moderation in terms of how much poverty could you live because you've got a family. There's a whole nother dynamic that's happening there.
And how about Mary Magdala? I just think that I tend to think of the recovery of her as a figure as being a very contemporary thing in my lifetime, watching, people like Chris Shank and other women theologians writing about her and trying to recover her feast day, which is July 22nd. I led a number of prayer services over my years at Pax Christi to honor her. So tell us about that. That really interests me, that it actually, has these deeper roots.
Well, actually, I'm giving a presentation on tonight at St. Michael's, and I will be doing it at Pax Christi in March on journeying through Lent with Mary Magdalene. So this is kind of an outgrowth of this. My story is that when I worked for a number of years, and I still do, on medieval eschatology, which includes, of course, focusing on the resurrection of Jesus and what that means, which actually led me to start writing about Holy Saturday and seeing Holy Saturday as a twin day to Easter in the medieval Franciscan tradition and the Orthodox especially. But I used to do, or I still do, tours of the Basilica of St. Francis. And one of the chapels I always sort of avoided because not avoided purposely, but there was not enough time when you have a tour to do. I did actually tour the Basilica in 20 minutes with Ferrari drivers. There's like 200 that showed up, and I had a segment of them. And at the end of it, I said to them, like Francis, you could be free. So just give me your keys and you could be free of your material for your car. Well, not one person took up the offer. So I didn't get a vocation out of that aspect. But so when I was doing these tours of the Basilica, there's a chapel there dedicated to Mary Magdalene. And I read a book, or an article, I should say. Janet Robson, who is deceased, she died of cancer. She is an English scholar. Fascinating article of looking at Judas through the lens of the lower basilica, because Judas shows up all over the place. And so that led me, she stops in that chapel. So I started hanging out in that chapel. And I realized in my own interpretation of that chapel, there's a view of, and of course, in Mary Magdalene studies, we know that there's a conflation that happened. There's a lot of Marys in the New Testament. So who is the real Mary Magdalene has been a major New Testament question. But the medievals accepted Gregory the Great's conflation of the Marys. And so you have Mary, the woman who is the penitent woman in Luke 7, that was considered to be Mary Magdalene. You have Mary Magdalene with Martha and Lazarus and the raising of Lazarus. And then you have Mary Magdalene with the don't touch me scene, the non mi tangere scene in the garden, where she is the first one, according to John's gospel, who encounters the risen Jesus. So I trace that to the medieval conception, popularized very much by Bonaventure, about the triple way, which is called, the triple way is the mystical way through purgation, illumination, and union. So for me, that was the model by which I saw the penitent woman of Luke 7, purging herself of her past and seeking and getting that mercy. Then in the raising of Lazarus, it was she recognizes that not only is Jesus is this person who is full of compassion, but even has the power to raise the dead. And then across from there is the scene of the don't touch me scene, the garden, in John's Gospel, chapter 20. And that's where she experiences the risen Christ. And for me, that's the culminating moment. That's her magical moment of being the first one, and that encounter becomes this. And that's where she becomes, as you mentioned, the apostle to the apostles, because then she's told of that. So for me, it's still looking through the lens, and I'm still waiting for. I belong to the Trecento Society. These are people who study medieval art, especially in Italy, and I've been waiting to see the response to this book. It's been out for 3 or 4 years now, I think, and I've not heard from the art world whether they agree with my interpretation of this. The world of academia, we get a little, but I use it for the sense of spirituality, and that's why I can use her like I'm doing tonight. I'm doing this retreat on showing how she moves from this penitent woman to one who sees who Jesus is, and then experiences the resurrected Christ, and then becomes, later on, she becomes sort of the resurrector, but that's a whole other story. That's like the apostles that raise the dead. She also is, through intercession, she does that same thing.
Now,
And
Father
so she
Steven.
takes, okay, go ahead.
No, this is also fascinating, Father Steven. I'm recalling it's been now 35 years since you and I lived together and had lovely conversations like this, but it's also been 35 years, really, since I've gotten daily updates on Alfonso de Espina. And so I have to ask for just a brief insight into this, because life experience has come to show me that, maybe Alfonso de Espina didn't necessarily espouse or embody the charism of Francis as a peacemaker in this age of medieval polemics, of us versus them, this in-group, out-group psychology. We have the example of Francis going out to the Sultan and treating him as a brother, and yet we have a person like Alfonso de Espina, I'm led to believe, who really villainized our Jewish and Muslim siblings. I'm wondering if you can help to give us some context, especially in the context of this now 21st century movement toward ecumenism and bridge building and peace. When we think of St. Francis, we think of someone who embodied peace. Any reflections on the whole dynamic as one who has studied thoroughly Alfonso de Espina and medieval polemics, and how that fits with the charism of his founder, Francis?
Well, and I think that's a good point. I think especially the issue of, did these friars have all the literature available that we do now, the 29 or 30 texts that we have from Francis? Because clearly, and this is the work of this Pietro Maranesi, who I've been drinking from the stream of his wisdom that he has been writing about, that did they forget this compassion and mercy because of Francis? And I think in that age of the 15th century, it was such a violent, chaotic world in the sense of, and like you said, it's an age where you're really, it was very easy to other groups, especially Jews and Muslims. And so that's why I studied Alfonso de Spina, and I just, many years ago, I left him just because I got after a while, polemical literature just sort of starts burning you. And I want to find something else. So I turn more to this eschatology, medieval preaching, getting back into Francis. For me, that was giving me more life and energy. And that's what I really seek for this. And so, like you mentioned, Francis, I believe part of these circles of mercy and compassion extend out actually to the Muslim community, because I'm more convinced than ever that Francis mentions, as he does in what we call the primitive rule, which is well, the rule of 1221 before the official rule is approved in 1223, which becomes more of a legal document. He has this thing about missionizing, and one of the things is, first of all, to just live among other people and be subject to them, which is really an incredible thing you think about the Middle Ages. And so Francis envisioned friars just simply going and living among Muslims, very much like Charles de Foucauld did in the 20th century. And then the second thing was, if you feel called to it, then you preach. But Francis was, I think, recognizing he went there certainly, I think, to convert the Sultan. This would have been, I don't think he would have known what interreligious dialogue, even though he had an opportunity to preach, I think, when he was with the Sultan, at least what the early sources say. So, but Francis, I think, was bringing that mercy and compassion to those people, to the Sultan, but I think he envisioned that's what he was bringing to them.
Yeah,
And so I think rather than othering people, I think Francis saw this bond there. And that's what I started at St. Louis University, and John Renard was a teacher he had come from Harvard and he was teaching Islam. And I took a number of his classes. He was another mentor of mine, because now I work for the last 25 years in Minneapolis, St. Paul. I've been trying to work more in Muslim Christian dialogue and stuff. We've had a dialogue going on for every third Sunday for, I think, over 30 years. And I've been a part of that, the dialogue of various things. And especially in the world, in Minneapolis, St. Paul, where a lot of othering is going on with, for example, the Somali community here, that I think this is my medieval Franciscan sense is saying, don't do that. They're just the new kids on the block.
Yeah, that's so true. And I've really admired what you've done, Stephen. I know you've been kind of out there as a regular voice, and it's a great caveat for us and for our listeners that we, as we think about these figures over the evolution of the charisms of religious orders, that they're always situated in their historical context and they evolve, right? And we can't necessarily take our contemporary lenses, which are shaped by so many factors, particularly in the past 100 years, and look through those lenses and judge and evaluate. So I appreciate your evolution away from the polemic. But I was thinking about our region. You've been here in the last few months, as have I, in a time of, we're in a time of great polarization. We do live, most people might not realize that you think of Minnesota as being a bunch of, Scandinavians, when in fact we are very, very plural in the metro, in the Minneapolis, St. Paul area. What do you think the charism of Francis, as you've been recovering it personally and then certainly intellectually and professionally, what does it have to offer us in this time when there's so much fragmentation, there's so much polarization? There is definitely, as you mentioned, a demonization of the other. I would just love to hear any insights you have as you've journeyed in the last 3 months. How has your Franciscan perspective informed the way you relate to what's going on in culture?
Well, I think especially in getting back to this theme of mercy and compassion, this is what I see as central to the gospel. I think we've lost, in a certain sense, lost that. I think certainly in the Franciscan tradition, for me, I've been looking at this, and I actually preached about this a couple of weeks ago. I've gone feeling wise for what's happening here in Minneapolis and St. Paul with ICE, and that I find that I am a mixture with sadness that we could treat other human beings, especially in the year 2026, we could be treating people like we're treating them. No matter who, whether they're legal or non-legal, whatever, how we treat other human beings. And this is Christians doing it. And I think we've lost this sense of what that really means in terms of in compassion. And it also brings up in a deep thing of anger that that what we're doing to other human beings here. And so I was preaching about that, and I sense this is what always brings me back to mercy and compassion. And as I try to do in my own life, which is sometimes very difficult, of like every moment of the day saying, what is the most merciful, compassionate thing I can do today? Because what compassion means, compassio, means with suffering. And as I remind my students, the medieval vision of love, and I think this is very much Franciscan, the height of love is to suffer with another human person and to be with that other person. It's not romantic love, it's not sexual love, it's, all those things are great, but in their own place. But what the gift, I think, of Francis' message is that how can I be compassionate every single moment, and how can I extend that mercy? Because as I reflect on the liturgy, when we celebrate that penitential rite, we are really, and I think this is Francis' experience of liturgy, was every moment of that liturgy, we experience that mercy. And we have to pass that mercy on to others. So for this, for the othering that has taken place, I think mercy and compassion cuts through that and says what we have before us is another human person, made in the image and likeness of God with dignity, and therefore I must treat them that way, whether they're legal or unlegal, whatever background they're. That's what I experience with the Muslim community here. The students I've had, the people that I've been dialogue with. I'm still mourning the loss of Awais Bayunis, who was originally from Pakistan. We just had this great fellowship, and we could talk about weaknesses of our own tradition as well as our strengths. And we were there in dialogue with one another because we were sharing mutual understanding and respect, which is what the Nostra Aetate called in paragraph 3 that's on Islam, that's what it called us to do. Mutual understanding and respect, meaning keep looking. Respicere in Latin means keep looking and keep trying to find the common ground. Because I find now with this othering, it's like that is being lost. We're just trying to find the differences. And therefore it's easy to dismiss, and especially in the world today, is demonize the other. And that is not the Christian message. That is not what Jesus taught, nor is that the Franciscan message.
Father Steven, I'd love to massage another element of Franciscan spirituality. The context for this is, of course, after studying at St. Louis University with the Jesuits there, as a young conventual Franciscan friar myself, I like to joke that I have a Jesuit mind and a Franciscan heart. And I try to distill the essence of the Franciscan charism into the most simple way possible when I'm preaching to the people of God. So I'll often say that Francis had this insight, as we see expressed in his Canticle of Creatures, that if God created me and if God created you, then we share this relationship. We have the same Father, Mother, Creator, God, which makes us siblings. But Francis took it a step further into all of creation. If God created me, and if God created that earthworm crossing the road, then I have a special relationship to that earthworm as well as brother or sister, Francis would have said in his very gendered Italian language. So I'm wondering about this aspect. Reverend Trish had spoken about how it is that St. Francis is most often depicted holding birds or standing beside a deer or with a squirrel or with a wolf or with whatever other animals. And we know that he is the patron saint of ecology. What might we learn from St. Francis and the Franciscan charism in a world where we see, for instance, EPA rollbacks and or climate change denial? What gives me hope personally is that there's so many young people who are rising up and who are really interested in stewarding this earth and protecting it for future generations. Just wondering if there's anything that you might say with respect to Francis's love of creation and what that might say to us today in this 21st century.
Mm-hmm. Well, Pope Francis used for that encyclical Laudato Si, which is on the environment. He used Francis' Mechanical Creatures for that kind of base text, foundational text. Now, what develops in the Franciscan tradition, which I actually spent a whole class on, which ties up not only the environment, but also the Muslim world, because what develops in which has already been there. There's a little complicated thing, I'm sorry. But Bonaventure develops this whole thing called vestige theology, basically meaning that all creation is stamped with God's presence and all manifests God's wisdom, power, and goodness. And so there's this, and when I look at creatures, I see that presence there. It's not, it's not God. We're not talking about pantheism, but it's talking about that presence. And therefore, it all reflects, if I look at those creatures, I see a manifestation of the divine in each one of those creatures, each one of them individually. And so I can see that. And then, when you get to human beings, then the likeness, the imageness turns more to likeness in the sense of how we live out our virtues, especially the virtues of faith, hope, and love, but then the cardinal virtues a long way. We manifest that likeness with God. And so that's what we share. Every one of us, every creature is stamped with God's presence, meaning the image and likeness of God, regardless of where they are. Now, how this connects up with the Islamic world is that in the Quran, it also speaks of this vestige theology. It speaks of that everything around us is stamped with God's presence and all points back to Allah, the creator. And so I have spent a lot of time working on Bonaventure in the Islamic thought, or the Quran, on that thing of manifesting that harmony. And that's why I think Francis, I think especially Bonaventure in the Franciscan tradition, really saw how the harmony comes about when we see everything stamped with that presence. And if they're stamped with that presence, then I must respect that presence and I must protect that presence. And I can't damage that. And
Father Stephen, you and I have not spoken since the election of Jorge Maria Bergoglio as Francis, the Patriarch of Rome, the Bishop of Rome. I'm just wondering if you might be able to, for our listeners, pull back the curtain and tell us what was it like to be a Franciscan in that moment, hearing a Jesuit come out and choose Francis as the name that he would take as Pope. And I'm just imagining there was a real affirmation of you and your charism in that moment. But I'd love to hear from you what it was like for you and all of your Franciscan sisters and brothers to have lived through that papacy.
when he first announced he chose Francis, I thought he was talking about Francis Xavier, but the Jesuit missionary. And then when I heard he's Francis, it just fit his character. It's like he, in fact, I just purchased a book. I'm a book addict here, but I admit I'm powerless over buying books, but my life has become unimaginable because you probably see behind you blurred is my bookshelf, and that's not, I've got piles here. No, but Francis, I think, embodied this. I bought this book on mercy from him, and that is, he had this really great pastoral sense to him and very much about the poor and stuff. I mean, just one example of Holy Thursday, usually it's the Pope washing the feet of the boys, as I say, the cardinals and the bishops. And he, in his pontificate, he would go out to this prison and the jail of Rome. And I think he said something more to the Muslim community than I think all of the documents. And he actually kissed the foot of this Muslim girl, and in the Islamic world, there's no issue of him touching. You're not to touch a male is not to touch a female unless you're in the family, and like there was none of that. They saw that gesture as he was in his humble, just demeanor. He showed this act of compassion with it, and I think it stays in my mind. I think one of the greatest things he ever said during his whole time as Pope was the pastors must smell the sheep. he had that phrase, and it meant you have to go out and you have to be with the people, experience what they're experiencing, and show them as much as possible and share. And I think especially share mercy and compassion with them and realizing we're all on the same journey. And that's what I think he's done. I've not done enough work about what he has talked about with the Muslim community, but I think it's been very much in line with John Paul II, Benedict. There was a little hiccup there, but then we had with Francis, he was very much seeing what we share in common. And so it's very much, he was a Jesuit with very much a Franciscan heart, even though this upsets the Jesuit friends of mine, because they say, well, what do you think? We have like cold hearts, whatever. And we have just the big minds. But I think he showed this. I think he was very much in the spirit of Francis. And, for me, it's been great. I've got 3 Jesuit degrees, but yet the centerpiece, that's like the bread, the centerpiece, whatever you choose for that centerpiece of meat, cheese, whatever, vegetables, whatever that is, that's really the Franciscan element. And so we kind of cross over. He was a Jesuit with a Franciscan heart. I a Jesuit mind, or train, but very still much a Franciscan heart. And so we share that sort of commonality.
Father Steven, I have one last question for you on this 800th anniversary of the passing of Francis, and that is, because you have traveled the world and seen so many Franciscan sites, what are some of the top Franciscan destinations, if you will, that you might point our listeners to, either here in the United States and or abroad? I'm remembering, for instance, that when I was the president of a high school here in Austin, Texas, I flew Sister Joanne Schatzline down to Austin to help with a pilgrimage of Franciscan Mexico. And how fascinating that was to go into Zacatecas and Real de Catorce, a little silver mining town in Mexico, and to see the Franciscan influences in these places. From your travels and the travels of others within the Franciscan order, what are some of the places that you might say are at the top of the list for anyone who during this 800th anniversary of Francis wants to go out and experience a bit of that Franciscan charism in a Franciscan site?
Well, certainly Assisi is that. You cannot beat that. I still think that the spirit of Francis just still permeates this, and I know that people have gone there. If you're open to it, it's one of what the Irish call thin places, and so certainly Assisi is that. I really think Padua still for Saint Anthony. By the way, St. Anthony hasn't come through. I lost a card with 4 gift cards that was worth $200, and Anthony still hasn't come through for me. But so but Padua, I think, is really. I just really think if there's a twin to Francis, Anthony was that. I myself have found a commonality in this with the Franciscan tradition, with the Dominican tradition in Siena, because there is the Franciscan presence, but also the Dominican presence, especially with Catherine of Siena, which is one of my heroes also. She was just born on the wrong side of town. She was born on the Dominican side and on the Franciscan side. So but I find that she was very much that. I'm stuck in Italy. So for me, Florence is a great place to go, especially Santa Croce, because you can see the kind of the development that goes on with the Franciscan movement there and the art that's there. It's Bologna has also become a place that the friars were at that still permeates that presence, especially in the world of art.
Father Steven, I just want to throw out for those in the United States as well, you mentioned Cary, Ohio. I was raised in the shadow of Our Lady of Consolation there in Cary, Ohio, a tremendous pilgrimage site here in these United States where the friars continue to minister as well. I hold in my heart a deep, deep place. In fact, I was just riding on Cary, Ohio yesterday. It was the feast of St. Polycarp yesterday. And we remember in 2013 how the relics of St. Polycarp were stolen. And it reminded me of how it was that the jeweled crowns of Our Lady of Consolation were stolen various times over the history of, well, the worth of sacred objects. Father Steven, we've come to the point in our conversation where we tend to share some final words. And so if you don't mind, I'll jump in first, and then I'll look to Reverend Trish, and then we'll give you the final word on this episode. The word on my heart today is gratitude, Father Steven. What a delight. It's been 36 years since we first lived together in St. Louis and had such delightful conversations on a daily basis. I miss you. It's been fun having this conversation with you. I am so grateful to you and to all of the friars for the education and the formation that I received and for sharing with me the Franciscan charism. Words cannot describe the value of something like that, of being able to take that into ministry and to help to cultivate a real Franciscan spirit among the people of God. So to see you again, to see your Franciscan joy, to hear of your very conventual scholarship, it just makes my heart warm. And I just am so glad to be connecting with you again here on Cutting Edge Catholics podcast. Reverend Trish.
Well, how much fun. Thank you so much, Stephen, for coming on with us. And I think the thing that I'm sitting with is twofold. One was your description of when you talked about Francis going to the Sultan and that he was not there to convert, and you would preach the gospel if you really had to. And that, that one of the things that I have admired about everything I have read and heard about Francis is this idea that living as a disciple of Jesus is far more important than anything we're going to repeat or say or quote. That the demonstration of our lives is so powerful. And then when you were talking about Pope Francis, I was thinking this is why he was so loved, because he was willing to express in his own life his fundamental discipleship, despite the fact being the pontiff, being the head of the whole operation. He had a kind of humility and authenticity and a generosity of spirit. I when you started talking about that, I remember when we all first read about his visits into these settings on Holy Thursday they were so disruptive at the time. It was so radical that he would dismantle this kind of formality of we're going to act this little pageant out and actually live that idea of the foot washing and blessing and forgiveness and humility. And so I think that's the thing I'm taking away and from my own spiritual life is that question about how do I live my discipleship. So I don't know, maybe I'll develop a Franciscan heart. We'll have to check back in a year. I think if I went to Italy with you, I'd probably be well on my way. So I might have to lobby you. Just really, really wonderful to hear everything you had to say. But we always like to give our guests the final words. So anything you want to add or share with us as we close out our time together?
I really appreciate both of you. I know, Jayme, it's been a long time, and Trish, we don't get together enough. So I hope that we can do that. But for me, the closing thing is I want to say, and this gets into a favorite place of mine to go to, just because it connects up all this stuff, is Francesco Ripa. It's the place in Trastevere especially because Lady Jacoba was there. This is a friend of Francis's, and so it was a way that Francis shared that gift with a rich noblewoman and so Francis even he did not see anything. Well, I think the vision of Francis basically is that nothing should keep us separate from one another, and we should always be together. And I believe that for me, the final word I have here is that I think the essence of Francis of Assisi, and this is what I've tried to embody in my own life, is realizing that everything that I have, even my own being, is God's gift. Everything. including, especially, above all, is God's mercy and compassion. And I think that's what Francis experienced. And that becomes a thing that everything then makes sense. His grace of poverty, humility, all of the other stuff comes from that center. And I think this is what Pope Francis especially was capturing, that center of the heart. And that heart that is full of mercy and compassion, and wrestles with all the things of human life that prevent that mercy and compassion to coming out. But above all, it is, I think, the message, Francis's message for our world right now, which sees so much division that's going on, not only here, but around the world, that what we need to do is really focus on compassion and mercy, especially embodied in the very human Jesus that we see manifested, in especially in Luke's gospel, and the one who's reaching out to the poor, the sick, the people who are strangers, what we'd call the immigrants now, all of the people that he reached out to. That's what we should be doing. And I think that's what the gift of Francis is for us. And so I've appreciated, I love to be able to share with fellow Franciscans, even though we'll adopt you, Trish, right now into our family. And because Francis extends that invitation out, even to the Jesuits, even to you at this time.
Thank you, Father Steven McMichael, a Conventual Franciscan Friar of the province of Our Lady of Consolation and a professor at the University of St. Thomas in the Twin Cities. A big thank you as well to all of our listeners. Thank you for joining us for Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance. I'm Father Jayme Matthias.
And I am Reverend Trish Sullivan-Vani.
Let's live the spirit of St. Francis. Pace bene, peace and all good.
Yes, pace bene.
Thank you for joining us for Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance. For more information on inclusive Catholicism, please visit extraordinarycatholics.faith. Keep the faith.